The way inflation is measured is the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, which basically measures a basket of goods that make up the American budget. And the year over year, they sort of measure if that basket increases in price over time, and the rate at which the price of the basket increases is the stated inflation number that the Federal Reserve gives you. Or is it? Sorry, geez, this who puts out that number? Is it the?
It's the Bureau of Labor of Labor Statistics. To say that one fast.
Yeah.
And they're going to measure different areas of the country. So they will measure the regions that they have 4 basic regions within the Northwest, West, Midwest, and South. And they're going to measure those consumer goods are measured in. There's about 80,000 individual consumer goods that they measure, and they are measured in 3 major metropolitan areas, being New York, Chicago, and LA. And you're going to get into things like housing and food, recreation, culture, transportation, furnishings for your home again, alcohol and tobacco, which is always funny to me that we would measure that with inflation. But insurance and financials, education, clothing, commuting, transportation, things like that are all going to be considered in there. The thing that is interesting to me is if you look at from a month-to-month time, some of those jump. They don't all move in unison, obviously. If I look at, and I was looking online here before we got on, gasoline is up 9% in the past month. Natural gas is up 5% in the past month. Food is only up 0.1%. But over the past year, over the past trailing 12 months, that inflation index is up 2.6%. So to give you an idea what that means, if I make $35,000 right now, over a year's time, I'm essentially giving away roughly $1,000 of my purchasing power. And so when you think about inflation, it's that silent thing that kind of happens. Nobody's in there literally taking money from you, but that purchasing power of your money is eroding. So much so that if I'm making $35,000 in 10 years, I'm going to have to make over $45,000 to have the same spending power that $35,000 has today. And that is one of the reasons why the Federal Reserve, part of their dual mandate is to keep that inflation in check, because if I'm a retiree on a fixed income, that's a big problem for me if inflation is rising. Even just 2.6% is a big number over time.
Right. Yeah, and then they sort of use the CPI they use that as a gauge to administer Social Security benefits and other government programs. But there's actually a lot of interesting research being done on how the CPI understates inflation. So it sort of measures a constant basket of goods, but it doesn't take into account the decrease in quality. So, for example, it doesn't take into account that you can substitute goods and you could maybe pick a cheaper good and it would be the same price of the basket, but at the same time, the standard of living or the quality of the goods is actually decreasing. You can't really capture that with the CPI.
Yeah, and one of the tricks that some of the manufacturers will use when inflation is rising, and if there's a sensitive price point for that item, one of the things that the manufacturers can do is they can give you less of it, right? Mm-hmm. Instead of giving you 12 ounces of a soda, they can give you 10 ounces. And at first you might not know, right, the fun size, and you might not notice a whole lot, but over time you are taking more money to buy less.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking about last week about this is actually an example of the reverse, but we talked about McDonald's, how they said that they were going to start using 100% beef. They actually increased the quality over time. So I guess that's a counterpoint, right?
That is a counterpoint.
Yeah.
Did you go into, so how do we actually measure the dollar? Did you take a look at that? Like, when we look at the value of the dollar, what do we actually look at when we're determining if the dollar's purchasing power is rising or declining?
Well, I mean, they use the CPI, but isn't it in relation to like other foreign currencies?
That's one of them. Yeah, they have 3 basic ways in which they do that. They have the dollar index, which is an index that measures the dollar against 6 other world currencies. Off the top of my head, Japan, Swiss franc, China is in there, the euro is in there, the silver, pound sterling is one of them, and I'm missing one of them. But basically, that'll kind of tell you what the dollar is doing, how it's moving against other currencies. And then they'll also compare it to the 10-year Treasury note. The dollar tends to move lock and step with the 10-year Treasury note. And so if we have let me get this right. If I get a falling yield, we're actually getting a rising dollar at that time. And then the other one is what they look at is the currency reserve that other countries, the global currency reserve is the U.S. dollar. And the way that happens is most countries, as they are importing and exporting, they are exporting more than they're importing. That way they have a surplus of U.S. dollars. They keep those U.S. dollars on hand, and they serve as the reserve currency.
Yeah, and then some people think that Bitcoin's going to be the global reserve currency of the future, which I mean, it's,
well, that's again
yeah. I mean, in my opinion, it's probably not, but I mean, it's just an interesting thing. It's just interesting.
Yeah. Well, that is kind of the problem with inflation is, and that's the debate is, we've taken inflation as it's natural, right? The Federal Reserve targets inflation and they say we want to have it between 2 and 3%. And that's normal. And so if you think about that, you really have to prepare for that if you're an investor. Because if every year, the Federal Reserve is okay with taking away 2 to 3% of my purchasing power, I need to be in assets, as we discussed in prior podcasts, I need to be in assets that appreciate faster than they're taking it from me.
Right. Yeah, and then inflation in itself, that actually helps with the appreciation of assets. So it's you can actually benefit from inflation by owning assets. And the only time inflation really hurts you is if there's like hyperinflation or stagflation, which we'll get to later. But if you're just sitting on a mountain of cash, then yeah, that's probably the worst case scenario, and you'll really get hurt by inflation. But you can actually also benefit from inflation if you're a smart investor.
Yeah, that's essentially, so inflation, that would be asset inflation is what we're looking for. So we want the value of our real estate to go up. We want the value of our stocks to go up, the value of our gold, our silver, our Bitcoin, whatever you're investing in, that hopefully is appreciating over time.
But then also, like, let's say Apple has to charge $2,000 for an iPhone, and their revenue, and the same amount of people buy iPhones, let's just say the dollar gets devalued by that much, their revenues would also see that increase, because if the money supply is bigger and they charge more for an iPhone and sell the same amount of iPhones, then their revenue measured in US dollars would actually increase, and then earnings per share would increase as well. So it can help that way as well.